Hey everyone, welcome to Church Online. We are so glad that you could join us today. My name is Megan and I'm a pastor on staff here and I have the privilege of hosting the service today. For those of you that don't know, we are one church in 3 locations. So if you're ever able to join us in person, we would love for you to check out one of our campuses in Westland, Milwaukee, or Beaverton. In the meantime, we'd love to meet you and help you get connected. The best way to do that is to click on one of the links below or check out our website. Our mission as a church is to inspire people to know, love, and follow Jesus. We absolutely love our local communities and want to do whatever we can to help make a difference in the world as we learn what it means to follow Jesus together. I hope you'll find today's message challenging and encouraging, so let's lean in and engage. Hey everyone, welcome to Church Online at Hope City. My name is Megan Lemons and I'm the pastor of Home Communities and Rooted at our Willamette campus. And I'm just so happy to be able to be here with you today. This week, we're wrapping up a series that we've been in all summer called The Greatest Stories Rarely Told. In this series, we've been looking at different stories in the Bible that you probably haven't heard of. Stories that have something wonderful to teach us, but just aren't talked about that much. The cool thing about this is that whether you've been around church for a while or if you're new to all of this stuff, these stories are pretty new to many of us, and so we get to explore them together and what God might have to teach us through them. So since these stories are rarely told, in a way, we're all coming to them with fresh eyes. Each one of these stories is being looked at from the unique lens of our core values as a church. Each month of this summer, we've taken a deep dive into our core values of sacrificial generosity, radical hospitality, and this month, and specifically today, we're looking at uncommon humility. Here's the thing about these values. We didn't just make these up. Well, we did put the words together in a way that would be memorable and serve to point us to Jesus, but we didn't just pull them out of thin air. These concepts are biblical. They are rooted in who Jesus is and what we see Jesus doing. And so as a church, we want to live into these values. We want to be folks who are having a real kingdom impact on our families and our workplace and in our world. And we do this by following the example of Jesus as he showed us how to live this way. We want to be people who move past simply knowing things and information or simply knowing what these core values are and having them written on a wall or being people who can find them on the website to being people who truly embody these practices of sacrificial generosity, radical hospitality, and uncommon humility. And today specifically, we are going to be looking at what it means to embody uncommon humility. But what does it mean to embody something? According to a simple Google search, embodiment means this. It means to a tangible or a visible form of an idea, quality, or a feeling. When we talk about embodying a belief, that's what we're talking about. And I can't think of a better example of embodiment and humility than in the person of Jesus Christ himself. In fact, Philippians 2, 5-8 gives us an example of humility and embodiment when it says this: "You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took on the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross." In Jesus, we see the ultimate example of humility. First, we see that he did not cling to his power. He did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Second, we see that he gave up his privileges. He gave up his divine privileges. And then the verse continues to say that he took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being, meaning he didn't think of himself as too good to be with people. And last, it says that he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death, meaning that he lived in obedience towards God. This is humility. This is the call to not just think these things to be good ideas, but to actually do them when the rubber meets the road. When we are confronted with opportunities to cling to power, we release it. When we're confronted with opportunities to hold on to privilege, we give it up. When we're confronted with the suffering of others, we don't just think of ourselves as too good to step in, and we don't think of others as too undeserving of our care. And ultimately, We choose to be people who submit ourselves to Christ and his Spirit living in us, to seek God and to seek what God might be doing, how God might be moving, and join him in it, even if that means giving up power and privilege and preference. And so today, we're going to look at a rarely told story found in the life of King David in the Old Testament. This is honestly a really wild story. Things start out bad, they get worse, they seem to get like a little bit better, and then there's this weird plot twist. But amidst the wild adventure of this story, there are these moments when we see a very uncommon humility on display. But before we can really get into this story found in the book of 2 Samuel, we'll need some context so that the whole story makes sense. So let's go back to the history of God's people. After God rescued his people of Israel out of Egypt, they asked him to stop guiding them with prophets and priests and give them a king to rule over them like the nations that were surrounding them. God agreed, but he warned them and he said, human kings are not all they're cracked up to be. Well, they did decide that they wanted a king, and their first king was Saul. All right, here's the deal with him. He was immediately successful, but success went to his head and he became selfish. His pride put the kingdom of God, the kingdom totally out of order. He cared really just for himself. He cared kind of for the people, and then he especially cared for God last. But God chose a new king to replace Saul, and his name was David. Now the Bible tells us that David, he was a man after God's own heart. Now, mind you, as you read David's story later on in the Old Testament, David is a king who makes lots of mistakes, like mistake after mistake after mistake. However, he regularly turns back to God in repentance, and though deeply flawed, he continues to seek God's guidance. So rewind back to the story here. You have Saul, who is the first king, and then you have David, who is the king chosen by God to replace him. And as far as kings and kingdoms go, this is not the usual custom of succession, right? Usually it would be the oldest son of the king that would become the next king. And David is not Saul's son, so it's kind of like, yikes. So the Bible tells us that as David is coming to power, that there's actually a military resistance from Saul's family when David comes to power, but he in fact does. And so now in ancient times, a new king either killed all of the members of the previous king's family or exiled them, eliminating competition of rebellion, like normal stuff. This consolation power was typically bloody and it was ruthless, but David did something different. Because he knew that God had made him king, he had faith that God would keep him king if he humbly served him. David demonstrated an uncommon humility when he broke with the ancient custom. He showed kindness to Saul's family, even allowing some of them to live in his own household. For years, David demonstrated deep humility, not because he never made mistakes, but for how he owned them and he turned away from them. Now, the story continues because as David got older, his sons began competing for who would become king when he died. And David, he chooses his wisest son, Solomon, to be the next king. But another one of his sons, Absalom, decided that he wants to seize power. The Bible tells us that Absalom was the people's favorite prince, and that as far as looks was concerned, Absalom was flawless, which is why he's depicted here as People's Choice Magazine Best Looking Man Alive, Idris Elba. Comments on people's beauty. The Bible regularly comments on people's beauty, but nonetheless, apparently Absalom was really, really good looking. So he uses his charm and his power and his good looks and manipulation to take power and claim the throne. All of this happens while David is alive and currently king. And so rather than fight his own son, David fled the city in humiliation with his staff and with his soldiers. Everything was turned upside down. He had no power. He had very little chance of survival. His pride was wounded. His family is a mess. And this is where we pick up our Bible story today. It's through this story that we're going to get a glimpse of what humility requires of us. So let's read it together. It's 2 Samuel 16, 5-8 is where it starts. And it says this. As King David came to Barium, a man came out of the village cursing them. It was Shimei, son of Gera, from the same clan as Saul's family. He threw stones at the king and the king's officers and all of the mighty warriors who surrounded him. Get out of here, you murderer, you scoundrel, he shouted at David. The Lord is paying you back for all the bloodshed in Saul's clan. You stole his throne, and now the Lord has given it to your son Absalom. At last, you will taste some of your own medicine, for you are a murderer. Yikes. David is fleeing the throne because of his son has wrongfully taken over it. He's seeking to spare his life. You guys, he is at a very low point right here. This is a family drama and dysfunction on a whole other level. And while he's fleeing, while he's at his lowest point, in walks from stage left this character, Shimei. We learned that Shimei is from Saul's family. Remember Saul, the first king, the one that David took over for when he died? Remember, David chose to spare the lives of the folks in Saul's family and show humility and mercy. So here you have someone from Saul's family line come out and start screaming at David. Picture this, David with all of his soldiers armed up, protecting David and his family, and out walks this enraged dude. He's screaming and he's cussing and he's yelling and he's hurling insults and actual rocks at David and his folks, claiming a couple of things. That one, David is a murderer. That two, David killed Saul's clan. That three, David stole the throne from Saul. And so God is now paying him back. And that four, that God is giving Absalom the throne. He claims things about David that just honestly are not true. Shimei is out of pocket here. This is a man who is deeply wounded and is just lashing out. And he's lashing out at the actual king and his officers. Honestly, I do not recommend this strategy. But what's super interesting here is there's two reactions that the Bible documents. First, we have the reaction of David's officer. In 2 Samuel 16:9, it says this: "Why should this dead dog curse my lord, the king?" Abishai, son of Zeruiah, demanded. "Let me go over and cut off his head." Reaction one, this man is really not acting how he should. He's wiling out, he's being disrespectful. And during this time, this type of behavior would have been punishable by death. So Abishai reacts with what would have been at the time the common response. He basically says, can we just kill this guy? His offense is legally punishable by death anyways. Out of protection of the king and potentially wounded pride, Abishai displays a common response. He desires to react on impulse and just go along with the common custom of the day. His power, his position, and his pride give him every right to react and cause more destruction and pain in an already painful circumstance. It reminds me of this one time, Austin, my husband and I were on the phone. He was picking up his parents from the airport, and we were on the phone together, and we got in a little bit of a tiff, a little bit of a skirmish, a little bit of an argument. We were fighting, okay? And we were arguing on the phone, and tones were starting to be raised, and we were just getting a little bit heated, and then I realized that my voice sounded weird as I was listening to it through the phone, you know? And I said to Austin, as he's driving with his parents, my in-laws, in the car, I said, wait, am I on speakerphone? And hesitantly, he says, yes. And I'm like, what? I'm so angry. I'm so embarrassed. My pride is wounded. I'm super irritated. And so I just say something short and I hang up, and I'm at work. And so I talk to my coworker. I'm like, can you believe my husband did this? You know, this is not my most shining wife moment, okay? But I was mad. And I was like, can you believe that he did this? And you know what her response was? She just goes, oh, you know what? You should just kill him. And I'm like, you know what? No, that's not the right thing to do. And, you know, Austin still lives, but I did go back and I reacted with not a whole lot of grace. And this is an option when our pride is hurt. This less than gracious response is actually what Abishai wants to display here in the passage today, but like on a whole nother level. But what's interesting here is David's response. David, instead of doing what was customary or what was common, displays an uncommon humility that puts a halt to this scene snowballing out of control. In verse 11, it says what David responds with. It says, David then said to Abishai and all of his officers, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore me to his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. It's not immediately clear if David actually thinks that God is using this man to judge him. But what is clear is that David uses this moment to not cling to his power, to not cling to his privilege, to not cling to his position and see himself as above this man. But what he does do is act in humility, which brings us to kind of our guiding question today is what does humility require of us? What does uncommon humility require of us? First, it calls us to slow down and to reach towards mercy. To slow down and to reach towards mercy. As we've established, David has every right to affirm his officials and have them destroy Shimei. It's perfectly within his power, authority, and privilege to do so. And I imagine because David was like a real, actual human person with real feelings, I wonder if he had this moment while all of this is going down, while he's scared, while he's frustrated, while he's running for his life, while he's tired, that this man starts throwing lies and stones at him, that he has a desire to just simply end it. This guy is a nuisance. He's being annoying. So he probably has this desire to just stick it to him, to end the scene right then and there. But instead, he slows down. He makes a choice not to react on impulse or on custom. His humility causes him to slow down and not react on impulse. David chooses the humble approach. He doesn't give in to what would have been custom, and he doesn't give in to what would have even been warranted. David chooses not to use his privilege to react, but instead he uses his power. And he uses his power to reach towards mercy. David didn't simply not reach for his sword. He mercifully chose to spare a life. In that moment, David chooses mercy over common practice. See, mercy is a show of compassion on someone with whom it is within reason and your power to punish or harm them. In a show of mercy, David chooses to spare the life of Shimei. It was perfectly within David's power to press in and make a bad situation much, much worse by destroying this guy. However, David expresses his humility as he slows down and reaches towards mercy and spares Shimei's life. So humility requires slowing down and choosing mercy. In the story, we see David doing this as he releases an opportunity to use his power and his privilege for his gain. But uncommon humility also requires something else. It requires that we seek God and ask questions. That we seek God and ask questions. David says to his officers, he says, leave him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore me his covenant blessing instead of this curse today. In this moment, David leans in and he essentially asks, is there any truth to what this man is saying? He leans in and says, maybe God is doing something here. Maybe God is at work. He submits himself not to this man, but to God. David's humility has him seek God and ask questions. David doesn't allow the way with which Shimei is expressing his anger to cause David to dismiss him entirely. Instead of dismissing him because of the way he's showing disapproval or expressing his pain, David leans in and he thinks, maybe God is doing something here. Maybe something is happening here that I should be paying attention to. And he even says, maybe God is punishing me. Because remember, while the things that Shimei is accusing David of are actual lies, David is no angel. And some scholars think that David is kind of wondering if the sins of his past are actually catching up to him. But regardless of the motive, David pauses. He's slow to react. He extends mercy, and he submits himself not to the accusations of the hurting man, but to the authority of God, and places the situation before God to be dealt with accordingly, because David here is acting in humility. So instead of just pushing his own power and privilege, instead of submitting to this man screaming at him, he submits the situation to God. Instead of dismissing this man entirely, David pivots the focus of the moment onto God, trusting that God will work and move. He leans in and asks, what's true here? In a way, he gets curious about the situation. And I think that we should do this in our lives too. You know, we all have eyes to see and ears to hear the vitriol that is being thrown out at people these days. You yourself may have been on the receiving end of someone's pain or frustration. When people are crying out in pain, it can become really easy to dismiss them when we don't agree with how they are expressing their pain and frustration, or when we don't agree with what they are saying. David's posture here, though, is really interesting to me because I think it has something to teach us about how we interact with other people. Because instead of outright dismissing someone's frustration because we don't like the way in which they present it or what they are saying, we can be challenged to pause and lean in and say, what does humility require of me here? It may be that humility requires that you slow down, that you don't react on impulse or say or do things that could make a hard situation much harder. It may be that humility requires of you that you lean in and you get curious and you wonder, what is this person actually saying? And then you take it a step further and you bring that before God and you ask God to search you. You ask God where he is working, where he is moving in the situation and where you might need to change. Seek and search before God and ask him if there is a reason maybe that this is being brought to your attention. So what does humility require? It requires that we slow down. We reach for mercy. David did this when he released an opportunity to exercise his power and privilege and instead showed mercy and spared a life. What does humility require of us? It requires that we seek God and that we ask questions. It requires that we lean into an expression of humility that has us leaning into God and submitting ourselves to him. And I'd love to tell you that this story ends with Shimei being the recipient of a humble king's mercy, and Shimei realizes, like the errors of his ways and everything's good. You would think that this would be the moment, right? That Shimei, seeing the compassion and the mercy and the humility of David, would stop hurling insults and lies. David acts with goodness towards Shimei. And what does Shimei do in return? Well, let's read verses 13 and 14 to see. It says this: So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite them. Okay. Cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination. Of course they arrived exhausted, and there they refreshed themselves. Shimei is like, look, can't stop, won't stop, all right? Though mercy has been shown to me, let me just double down on the destructive response and keep screaming and keep lying and keep throwing stones. The story of David and Shimei doesn't even end there on the road with the stones being thrown. The story actually continues when we jump into 2 Samuel chapter 19. I'll summarize it for us. The threat of Absalom, remember that David is leaving the area because Absalom is trying to take power and trying to take the throne. So the threat of Absalom is gone, and him taking power is gone because at this point in the narrative in chapter 19, Absalom is dead. David takes time to mourn the loss of his son, and then he's returning to Jerusalem where he will again be on the throne. And on his return home, who do you think we find? We find Shimei. Shimei comes back before David, groveling, begging for mercy, asking that David not remember the sins of his past, that he forgive him, and that he allows him to live. And David, oh my word, chooses humility again. He allows Shimei to live. He could have taken that moment to use his power, privilege, and position to swiftly end the life of Shimei. But he chooses another route. He spares his life. And you guys, this is where the story gets a little bit weird because there's kind of this odd plot twist of events that takes place. Let's fast forward to David on his deathbed. The story starts in 2 Samuel and it goes all the way to the book of Kings. So David, he's passed along the responsibility of king to his son Solomon. And as David is passing along his responsibilities at the end of his life on his deathbed, who do you think comes to mind? None other than Shimei. And he says to Solomon, basically, look, he's like, I spared Shimei. I made a treaty with him. I imagine this being like a Sopranos-esque moment between the two of them, right? He's like, I spared him. We had a treaty together. But look, Solomon, that treaty dies with me. Shimei is not a good person, and he's probably going to cause a lot of trouble. So you should just kill him. In fact, he says, deliver him a bloody death. What? David, you have been showing humility through mercy and compassion this whole time towards Shimei. And then what feels like all of a sudden, David is like, look, this dude is going to be a problem. He's got to go. Well, Solomon, also being a king who shows humility, extends compassion and mercy, and attempts to keep Shimei in line, not by killing him, but by giving him some boundaries, all right? He says he can live in the kingdom if he acts right and if he follows certain rules and certain boundaries. Now, knowing that Shimei is the type of dude who doubles down on his destruction, do you think he stayed within the boundaries? No, he didn't. And in the end, Shimei is ultimately held accountable for his actions. As we look at this story and we see David acting in humility, we see a king who let go of his power and his privilege. We see a king who slowed down and didn't just react on impulse. We see a king who showed mercy. We see a king who asked good questions and submitted himself to God and still continued to be treated poorly by this guy. Have you ever been in that situation where you had the option to choose to show uncommon humility by acting with mercy and compassion, and you chose to lean into what God might be trying to do? You chose the right thing. You chose humility and mercy. But instead of the person learning, instead of things changing, they just stayed bad. People just continued to lie. They continued to insult. Well, that's what's happening here to David. He chose the right thing, and this dude keeps doing bad stuff to him. Look, I want to be honest. Choosing humility and expressing it through mercy and compassion, choosing to live this way does not automatically mean that things are going to go right for us, that people will treat us with the same mercy and humility in return. And so we kind of get to this point in ourselves as we read stories like this and as we struggle to think, I want to extend humility and I want to extend mercy and I want to do the right thing. And we start to think within ourselves, and it just begs the question of what about justice, though? What about when it's more than just my pride being hurt? What about when things are just really unfair? What about when the person is acting destructively and lying or just deeply misguided? What happens then? Well, we have to work through figuring out how justice and humility come together. Are they enemies or can they be partners? Does this just mean that humility requires us to simply sit by while people spew falsehoods and destruction? Does humility require me to no longer seek justice, that we sit back while things go from bad to worse to even worse? Does humility mean I allow people to be treated poorly and do nothing about it? The answer? No, absolutely not. But it does mean that we live in tension. We hold the tension of extending humility through mercy while also seeking justice and accountability. These things are not exclusive of one another. They are to be held together. All of these are tensions held together in this story. David responds with humility through the narrative. Shimei receives mercy through David's humility towards him, and yet Shimei doesn't ever really change. And so ultimately, he's held accountable for the consequences of his actions. So holding humility and justice means we walk in tension. It's the tension that in the face of difficulty, in the face of unfairness, in the face of injustice, we are called not to react on impulse, but rather to slow down, to pause, to take a moment. We extend mercy. We ask good questions. We submit not to the authority of our emotions, but to the goodness and the righteousness of God. And it's from that place and from that posture that we seek justice. And you know what? Sometimes seeking justice means seeking accountability. Sometimes seeking justice means removing ourselves from a situation. Sometimes seeking justice means trusting God to bring about justice in the hearts and lives of other people. Sometimes we get to see justice achieved. Sometimes we just get to play a part. We just get to play a part in joining God in the work and a piece of it. And you know what? We can't prescribe what it will always look like. But what we can do and what we can know is that living humbly and extending mercy and seeking justice are not exclusive of one another. We hold the tension of extending mercy, seeking justice, and living in humility. And in fact, scripture in Micah 6:8 says that we are to be people who act justly, who love mercy, and who walk humbly. There is an expectation that as followers of Jesus, we are holding all of these things together. And we see all of these examples and all of these tensions most profoundly held in the person of Jesus Christ. In Philippians, the passage that we read at the start of this message, it tells us that Jesus came down to earth, that he showed mercy, that he submitted himself to God, and is giving his life for us so that we could have new life on the cross. Jesus sought both justice and mercy at the same time. So the question for us today is, what does humility require of us? It requires first that we slow down, that we act as we see here in the narrative, but most importantly, we imitate what we see Christ doing. We let down our power and our privilege and choose to live humbly by extending mercy. It second means that we seek God and ask questions, that we would follow the example set for us today, that we would lean into living in obedience to God as Christ did, and not just dismissing people's pain. And last, it means that we hold the tension of mercy and justice. This is what humility requires of us, that we slow down, that we act in mercy, that we seek God, we submit to God, we ask good questions, we lean in, we say, God, what are you doing here? And we hold and we struggle and we live in the tension of both showing mercy and seeking justice. Would you pray with me today? God, we thank you so much. We thank you for this example that you've set out for us in our passage today of what humility requires of us. God, ultimately, we thank you that you embodied the ultimate act of humility. When you came to earth, you lived among us and you gave your life so that we could have new life. We thank you for this example. And God, would you stir in us to live in this way, to give up privilege, to give up power, to give up preference so that we can be with other people, so that we can care for other people. It's in your name we pray these things. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us today at Church Online. We would love to connect with you. There's a couple ways that you can do that. You can click some of the links below on how to take a next step. Or you know what? We would love to see you in person on a Sunday. We have services at 10 a.m. We're just so looking forward to connecting with you. Have a great week.